Are there any good reasons to reject abortions? Not emotional appeals, not slogans, but reasons. Arguments grounded in clear thinking, sound philosophy, and what we actually know about human life. This is one of the most debated questions, at least here in the United States, and yet many people suppose that to oppose abortion, that you have to base your entire view on religion. But what if that's not true? What if there are actual strong philosophical and scientific reasons to hold that abortion is morally wrong? Reasons that anyone can understand and evaluate regardless of what they believe about God. And that's exactly what we're going to explore in this video. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rafael. I'm the host of the Small Town Bible Questions YouTube channel, where I answer your Bible questions and anything related to Christianity. If you're new to the channel, I would love it if you would like, subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell notification icon. That way you don't miss any of the future videos I make. Not only does it help me with the whole YouTube algorithm, but it really helps other people find this kind of content and join in the whole conversation. But now that the whole YouTube stuff is out of the way, let's get back into today's topic. Now, before we even get started, I want to let you know what to expect from this video. As you've probably already noticed, this is going to be a way longer video than what I'm used to probably putting out. But in this video, we're going to be going over a couple of things. First, I'm going to be developing a positive case by explaining why every human being possesses intrinsic value from the moment that they begin to exist. And we'll walk through the biology, the ontology, and the moral principles that ground human dignity. Second, we'll examine and respond to 6 of the strongest objections raised by pro-choice philosophers like Michael Tooley, Peter Singer, Marianne Warren, Derek Parfit, and Jeff McMahan, and Judith Jarvis Thomson. We're going to steelman each one of their arguments and try to present it fairly, and then we're going to be demonstrating why those arguments fail. Now, if you want to jump to any of those specific objections, you can, but if you're able to watch the whole thing, I encourage you to do so, because each section builds on the last, and the full picture only becomes even more clear when you watch from the beginning all the way to the end. But with that being said, let's begin. Now, though I'm a Christian who normally approaches this topic from an abolitionist perspective, for this particular video, I'm not going to be relying on that theological foundation. Instead, I want to show that even when we set scripture aside for the sake of the argument and only rely strictly on philosophy and science, the logic still points to the same direction, which is that abortion is the intentional killing of an innocent human being. And the framework that I'll be using in this video leans heavily from philosophers like Patrick Lee, Robert P. George, Christopher Tollefson, and John Finnis, who argue that human beings have intrinsic worth by virtue of what they are, not by what they can do. This approach, again, doesn't replace the Christian understanding of the human person. It simply shows that reason itself confirms the same truth that faith reveals, which is that every human life possesses unchanging dignity. And when we examine the question through that lens, everything comes down to one fundamental question, which is, what exactly is the being that abortion destroys? This question isn't only biological, it's metaphysical. When we talk about a fetus or an embryo, we're not just describing size or stage of a growth, we're describing a being in development. And the central philosophical claim of the anti-abortion position is that the embryo and the adult it becomes are numerically identical, one and the same individual continuing through time. Now, for some of those who aren't familiar with the jargon, when philosophers talk about numerical identity, what they mean is sameness of being, not sameness of appearance or abilities, meaning you are the same individual you were as a newborn, as a teenager, and as you are right now. Your capacities have obviously, changed, your body has developed, but you have not become a different organism. The same continuity applies to the human embryo. It doesn't transform into a new kind of entity at birth or when consciousness begins. It simply matures. And once we recognize the truth, the moral question becomes inescapable. If the embryo is already the same human being it will one day grow up to be, then destroying it is not ending a process, but ending a person's life at the earliest stages of existence. And when we look at this question biologically, the the evidence is unambiguous. At fertilization, when the sperm and the ovum unite, a new genetically distinct organism comes into existence. Not part of the mother, not part of the father, but a new individual of the human species. In developing human clinically oriented embryology, embryologists Keith L. Moore, T.V.N. Persod, and Mark G. Torcha write, human development begins at fertilization, the process during which a male gamete or a sperm unites with a female gamete or a oocyte to form a single cell called a zygote. This highly specialized totipotent cell marks the beginning of each of us as a unique individual. Similarly, Bruce M. Carlson explains in Human Embryology and Developmental Biology, at fertilization, a new genetically distinct human organism is formed. These are not moral opinions, they're biological descriptions. From conception, we're dealing with a self-organizing living human organism that directs its own development towards maturity. The embryo is not a potential human being, it is a human being with potential. Its growth is internally directed. It develops itself, not something else. Think of it like this. When a seed grows into a tree, it's not becoming a different kind of organism. It's simply unfolding what it already is by nature. In the same way, the human embryo is a complete whole organism from the start. It only needs time and nourishment to realize its inherent capacities. This is what distinguishes it from mere tissues or from a sperm or egg cell. Those cells are part of a larger organism. The embryo, on the other hand, from fertilization on, is a whole organism in its own right. So when we talk about the fetus, we're not describing a thing in transition from non-human to human, but a human individual in the earliest stages of its life. And if that's true, if from conception onward there exists a distinct whole living member of the human family, then the moral question becomes unavoidable. What obligations do we owe to that being? Because once we recognize that the embryo is already one of us, abortion can no longer be framed as removing potential life. It becomes the intentional ending of an actual human life. So the next question naturally follows. Why is it wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being? And that's what we'll explore next. Now, recognizing that the embryo is a distinct living human being brings us to the heart of the moral question, because once we know what the fetus is, we can no longer avoid asking what may or may not be done to it. And that question forces us to consider the moral principles that guide all moral reason. For example, every moral principle begins with a fact about reality. And the fact that we just established is that the unborn child is one of us, a member of the human species, the same kind of being that every adult who can think and reason about this question. So again, if it is wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being and the fetus is an innocent human being, then the moral weight of abortion becomes impossible to ignore. But that claim deserves more than just an assumption. It needs grounding. And we must ask, why is it wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being? What makes that act morally different from any other kinds of harm? And the answer is simple yet profound, and it's that every human being possesses intrinsic value. That value doesn't come from what they can do, but from what they are. To kill an innocent human being is wrong because it destroys a life that has inherent worth. That worth doesn't depend on age, size, ability, or awareness. It flows from the very nature of what a human being is. The moral principle, it's what philosophers call a prima facie duty, an obligation that binds us unless an overriding moral reason could justify setting it aside. The duty not to intentionally kill an innocent human being is one of those foundational truths. But again, in simpler terms, some actions are wrong by their very nature, and the burden of proof always lies on anyone who would make an exception. And if we deny that, we don't just undermine the case against abortion, we undercut the very logic that makes human rights possible in the first place. Also, again, when we say that human beings have intrinsic value, we mean that their worth is grounded in their essence, in the kind of being they are, not in their current functions or external qualities. A person does not earn worth by thinking, speaking, or choosing. They already have it by existing as rational moral beings. And philosophically speaking, what matters is the possession of an intrinsic capacity for rational and moral actions, not the immediate exercise of that capacity. And again, a newborn cannot reason, a sleeping person is not self-aware, and some in comas cannot make choices, but all still possess the natural capacity for rational activity because of the kind of being they are. To have an intrinsic capacity is to possess the ability in virtue of one's nature. For example, a seed, it has the capacity to become a tree even before it has roots or leaves. The potential is real because it belongs to that kind of seed, or it belongs to that seed by that very nature that it has. In the same way, every human being has the inherent capacity for rational and moral actions because that capacity flows from human nature itself. This understanding of intrinsic capacity preserves moral equality across all stages of human life. It recognizes what we are by nature, not what we can do at a given moment, is what grounds our worth. And that means that dignity is not something that appears when we reach a certain level of development. It's something we have from the beginning, as soon as we exist. Robert P. George and Christopher Tollefson summarize this point in their book, Embryo, A Defense of Human Life, where they say, "It is not merely that the human embryo will become a person, rather, it is the same individual who will later exercise personal capacities if allowed to develop naturally." Their point is that moral worth cannot suddenly appear partway through development, because the being who exercises rational capacities later is the very same being who exists earlier. The embryo is not a potential person waiting to become valuable. It already is a person with potential, already the same kind of being whom moral respect is due. If dignity depended on performance, then equality would be impossible. Some would always qualify more than others. Those with stronger reasonings, more developed awareness, or even greater dependence would count as more. The very young and impaired or even dependent would count as less. But again, that's not equality. The ontological view, though, provides the only consistent foundation for human rights. Every human being possesses the same intrinsic worth because every human being shares the same kind of nature, a rational, moral, embodied nature ordered towards reason and freedom. That's why it is wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being, because doing so violates the good of a being whose life is valuable in itself. And to kill the unborn, then, is not merely to end a biological process, it is to destroy one of us, a member of the human family, whose value is equal to that of every person. This conclusion does not rest, again, on religion, emotion, or sentimentality. It rests on reason, on an understanding of what it means to be human, and on the moral truth that human life has value simply because it is human life. And yet, not everyone accepts this view. Some philosophers claim that what makes someone a person is not simply being human, but possessing a certain level of abilities like consciousness, reasoning, or self-awareness. And in the next section, we'll begin going over those objections, starting with one of the most influential philosophers, Michael Tooley, who argues that only self-conscious beings qualify as persons. Now, Tooley claims that having a right to life requires more than simply being alive. It requires the current capacity for self-consciousness, especially the ability to conceive oneself as the same subject of experiences over time. He writes, "An organism possesses a serious right to life only if it possesses the concept of a self as a continuing subject of experiences and other mental states, and believes that it is itself such a continual entity." Tooley's reasoning unfolds in 3 steps. First, he links rights to interests. One cannot have rights to anything unless one has an interest in that thing. Second, he links interest to desires. One cannot have an interest in continuing to live unless one can form a desire to continue existing as a subject of experiences. And third, he argues that this requires a self-concept. A being must be self-aware in itself as the same subject over time in order to desire its own continued existence. Because fetuses and even newborns newborns lack this self-awareness, Tooley concludes that they are not yet persons and that therefore do not possess a right to life. He says, since a newborn baby is not a person and therefore not a subject of a right to life, infanticide is itself morally acceptable. And Tooley does not hide how extreme this conclusion is. He embraces it as its logical implications of his premises, and that is precisely why this argument must be taken seriously. But once we examine its assumptions and its consequences, the view begins to break down. First, if the rights to life depend on current self-awareness, then many humans we regard as persons would lose their rights whenever they temporarily lack that ability. For example, a sleeping adult, a victim rendered unconscious in an accident, a patient in a temporary coma, or a person with late-stage dementia are not currently engaging in self-conscious thoughts and cannot form desires about their continued existence in that moment, yet we know killing them would be murder. The absurdity is obvious. We all know human beings cannot gain or lose and gain and lose and gain and lose the most fundamental right simply by waking up or falling asleep. Human rights cannot turn on and off with consciousness. Rights must be grounded in something more stable, namely what that being is, not how it's currently functioning. Second, Tooley's standard confuses identity with function. He evaluates the worth of a human being based on what it can do right now, rather than what kind of entity it is by nature. But as we established earlier, human beings are organisms with a rational nature from the moment they exist. A newborn is the same individual who will later exercise those rational capacities, the same human person at a different developmental stage. To say that a newborn can be killed because it has not yet developed abilities it will naturally develop is to sever moral worth from personal identity. And third, Tooley's framework destroys equality altogether. If the rights to life depend on cognitive abilities, then those with lesser mental capacities, like infants, those who are mentally disabled, have lesser rights. Those with cognitive impairments may have none at all. This is not a theory that expands justice. It conditions justice on ability. It alleviates the strong and diminishes the weak. And history warns us where that leads. Though Tooley's argument is intellectually rigorous, it is built on the wrong foundation. It treats self-consciousness not as a capacity human beings develop because of their nature, but as the threshold human beings must cross to deserve protection. And once worth depends on ability, then equal human rights disappear. Another prominent philosopher who denies that all humans have equal rights to life is Peter Singer, one of the most influential ethicists in the world today. His view is rooted in what's called preference utilitarianism, the idea that what is morally right is whatever best satisfies the preferences of those involved. So in Singer's perspective, the right to life is not based on what you are, but on what you can want. He writes, "We should give greater protection to beings who have conscious preferences for continued life and who are capable of seeing themselves as existing over time than to beings who lack such preferences. For those who are self-aware, death is normally a greater loss than for those who are not." This leads him to argue that self-awareness and future-oriented desires are what makes killing wrong. Because newborns cannot yet form such desires, Singer concludes that many animals like pigs or chimpanzees may have stronger claims to life than human infants. He says, "When the death of a disabled infant will lead to the birth of another infant with better prospects of happy life, the total amount of happiness will be greater if the disabled infant is killed. The life of a newborn is of less value than the life of a pig, a dog, or a chimpanzee. Therefore, killing a newborn infant is not the same as killing a person." In other words, Singer believes the moral value of life depends on how much happiness that life can produce. And if replacing one's life with another creates more happiness overall, killing can be justified. For Singer, abortion and even infanticide can be morally permissible, even morally preferable if doing so fulfills the preferences of the parents or society. Now, this is not a misreading of Singer. It is exactly where his principle leads, and he openly defends those implications. But just like Tooley's, Singer's view ultimately collapses because it treats the right to life as something that appears only when a being becomes capable of asserting a preference for continued existence. If that is the foundation of moral protection, then those with the most developed mental abilities have the strongest rights, and those with the least have the weakest. That principle may sound consistent in theory, but when we follow it to its logical conclusion, it fractures the very idea of equality. On Singer's account, the right to life depends on the presence of a conscious preference, a self-aware desire to continue living. But a newborn, some with profound cognitive disabilities, or even an adult with late-stage dementia, lacks that reflective awareness. By contrast, a mature animal such as chimpanzees, dolphins, or pigs might possess it. If Singer's standard is correct, then a healthy chimpanzee could have a stronger claim to life than a human newborn. And Singer doesn't shy away from that implication. He writes, since a newborn baby is not a person and therefore not the subject of a right to life, infanticide in itself is morally acceptable. And again, that's not a distortion of his argument, it's the inevitable outcome. If the capacity for preference is what confers moral worth, then those who cannot express preferences fall outside of that circle of protection. Human rights become negotiable, dependent on ability and awareness, and whoever defines those thresholds decides who counts as human enough to matter. And this leads to three fatal consequences. First, preference-based rights create a hierarchy of human value. On Singer's view, someone with advanced cognitive abilities, strong desires, and clear self-awareness has a greater claim to life than a newborn, someone with severe disabilities, or an adult with advanced Alzheimer's. That system doesn't ground equality, it diminishes completely. It leaves the weakest without protection precisely when they need it most. Second, Peter Singer confuses the recognition of value with the possession of value. A being's worth does not depend on whether it can communicate that worth or ask for protection. A newborn cannot yet express the desire to live, but its inherent dignity does not wait for consciousness to catch up. To think otherwise is to mistake our ability to recognize value for the source of value itself. Human worth exists whether or not anyone acknowledges it. We don't grant dignity by noticing it, we honor it because it's already there. Third, Singer's approach destroys the foundation of universal human rights. If rights exist only when preference and awareness exist, then rights fluctuate with mental functions. They increase with intelligence, diminish with impairment, and disappear with unconsciousness. But human identity doesn't change that way. We remain the same beings through sleep, illness, infancy, and age. Rights tied to shifting mental states are unstable, and unstable rights are easily withdrawn. This is where Singer's reasoning ceases to be merely theoretical. It becomes dangerous. If we accept that moral worth rises and falls with cognitive performance, then equality becomes just an illusion, and the strong will always define the value of the weak. And history, again, has shown us where that logic leads. So in conclusion, Singer locates dignity in mental performance rather than in personal identity. But mental performance develops gradually and declines gradually, while the personal identity of a human being remains constant from the beginning of its existence to its end. And society, grounded in Singer's principles, cannot protect all human beings equally. It protects only those whose preferences are presently strong. Equal rights require a foundation deeper than shifting abilities, and only shared human nature provides that foundation. The third argument for the defense of abortion comes from philosopher Mary Ann Warren, whose essay on the moral and legal status of abortion remains one of the most cited works in contemporary abortion ethics. Warren's goal was to identify what personhood truly is, to define which beings count as members of the moral community, and therefore have rights. Warren argues that simply being biologically human is not enough. What matters, she says, is whether the being possesses certain psychological capacities that make moral agency possible. She writes, The traits which are most central to the concept of personhood or humanity in the moral sense are very roughly the following. 1. Consciousness of objects and events external and or internal to the being, and in particular, the capacity to feel pain. 2. Reasoning, the developed capacity to solve new and relatively complex problems. 3. Self-motivated activity which is relatively independent of either genetic or direct external control. 4. The capacity to communicate by whatever means, messages of an indefinite variety of types. And 5. The presence of self-concept and self-awareness, either individual, racial, or both. Warren claims that only beings who display some or all of these 5 traits can be considered persons with full moral rights, and since fetuses display none of them, they cannot be persons in the moral sense. According to her view, the unborn may be biologically human, but not morally human. Therefore, abortion does not violate any person's rights because the fetus is not yet a member of the moral community. Warren's view sounds appealing at first because it tries to anchor personhood in something observable like measurable traits rather than abstract metaphysics, but that clarity hides several serious flaws. First, her list is arbitrary. She gives no principled reason why these 5 particular traits and not others define personhood. Why not include membership in the human species? Why not potential for rational activity? If personhood depends on displaying some or all of these traits, how many does one need? 2, 3, all 5? What about those who only possess fragments of them? The list seems tailored to exclude the unborn, but it could just as easily exclude newborns, the severely disabled, and those who are temporarily unconscious. And again, if moral worth depends on a checklist of functions, then value comes in degrees, depending on how many traits one meets, which again destroys the very idea of equal human dignity. Second, Warren's account confuses capacity with performance. A sleeping adult does not lose the capacity for reasoning or communication simply because they are not currently exercising it. The same is true of an unborn child. It already possesses that intrinsic natural capacity to develop all these traits because it is the kind of being that does so by nature. To deny it moral worth until those traits appear is to make rights depend not on who one is, but on what one can currently do. The functionalist approach also faces a deeper metaphysical problem. It presupposes the very subject whose status it tries to deny. The exercise of reasoning or communication presupposes a being who performs those acts, a unified organism that remains the same through change. The fetus is precisely such a being. It is not a potential person, but a person with potential, a living, developing human individual whose inherent nature is ordered towards rational and moral capacity. It's as Robert P. George and Christopher Tolson explain. It is not merely that the human embryo will become a person, rather, it is the same individual who will later exercise personal capacities if allowed to develop naturally. Or in simpler terms, to even talk about reasoning or communicating, there already has to be someone doing those things. A single continuous being who remains the same through every stage of development. The fetus isn't some separate thing that will later turn into a person. It already is that person in an earlier stage of growth. Third, this framework, just like the last ones, lead to chilling implications. By Warren's standard, even a newborn infant would not qualify as a person, since newborns exhibit little reasoning, minimal communication, and virtually no self-awareness. And Warren acknowledges this herself, writing that infanticide might be permissible in some circumstances, though she tries to restrict it socially. But once again, the view that begins as philosophically careful ends up by justifying killing the weakest among us. And finally, Warren's position fails to explain why any of these capacities, once again, confer intrinsic worth at all. If moral status comes only from traits that allow for social interaction or rational communication, then moral value becomes a matter of social convenience, not truth. But if every human being has equal worth, that equality must rest on something deeper than fluctuating functions. It must rest on what we are. beings with rational nature from the moment we exist. So in conclusion, Wharton's criteria aims to make personhood objective and empirical, but they achieve the opposite. They make it arbitrary and exclusionary. And again, the only consistent foundation for human rights is shared human nature itself. When human rights depend on performance, some humans will always be less than persons. But when rights depend on identity, every human life matters equally, from its first moment to its last. Now, the fourth argument that we're going to cover comes from philosophers like Parfit and Jeff McMahan, who accept that the unborn is biologically human, but argue that biological humanity alone is not what matters for moral status. What gives life its value, they claim, is the degree of psychological connectiveness between one's present and future self, what Parfit calls psychological continuity. Parfit explains what matters for survival is not identity but psychological continuity and connectedness with the right kind of cause. In other words, Parfit argues that being the same human organism through time is not what matters morally. What matters is being the same stream of consciousness, the same pattern of mental states that continues from moment to moment. To put it simply, Parfit is suggesting that what truly makes you you is not your body or your biological life, but your mental life, your memories, your thoughts and feelings that link one moment of awareness to the next. So if those mental links were broken, Parfit would say that you, in the meaningful sense, have ceased to exist, even if your body remains alive. Building on this, Jeff McMahan develops what he calls the time relative interest account. McMahan agrees that early human life is biologically continuous with later life, but claims that our interest is in continued existence depends on how psychologically connected we are to our future selves. He writes, "The wrongness of killing varies in proportion to the strength of the psychological unity that a being has with its future self." Since embryos and fetuses have virtually no psychological connections with their future selves, no memories, no awareness, no mental continuity, McMahan concludes that their interest in continued existence is very weak, and therefore killing them is not seriously wrong. In other words, the more awareness and memory a being has, the stronger its mental bridge to the future, the stronger its claim to life. A fetus lacking any awareness or memory would therefore have almost no moral claim at all, while a conscious adult would have the strongest. Now, this view seems to offer a middle ground. It avoids saying that the unborn are nothing, yet it also avoids granting them full moral equality. But when we examine this view carefully, it collapses under its own assumptions. Parfit and McMahan's approach fails because it misidentifies what grounds moral worth. It replaces the being who has experiences with the experiences themselves. But again, experiences do not own themselves. They belong to someone, a continuing subject who persists through change. In other words, thoughts, memories, and feelings don't just happen on their own. They are the activities of a particular person. When you fall asleep or are under anesthesia, your mental activity stops, but you remain the same individual. So even when consciousness isn't present, the person, the human being, still exists. If moral value depends only on mental continuity, then human identity and therefore human rights shift whenever consciousness is interrupted. The person who sleeps deeply or falls into a coma would, by this reasoning, cease to have significant interest in continued existence. Yet we all recognize that such a conclusion is absurd. The sleeping individual and the conscious individual are the same person, even if the stream of consciousness is temporarily paused. Furthermore, McMahan's time relative interest measure reduces the right to life to a sliding scale. If the strength of one's psychological ties to the future determines the wrongness of killing, then the value of human life rises and falls with memory, awareness, and mental continuity. That means that a newborn would have a very weak claim to life, a child a stronger one, and a self-reflective adult would have the strongest of them all, while the elderly and the cognitively impaired would again fall at the very bottom. Such a view undermines the very idea of equal human rights. And if we follow this logic consistently, then killing a newborn with almost no psychological continuity would be seen as far less wrong than killing a self-aware adult. The moral gravity of killing would rise and fall depending on how developed someone's consciousness is, not on the fact that they are a human being. Finally, the appeal to psychological continuity presupposes the very thing it tries to explain, a continuing subject who experiences that continuity. There can be no psychological connectedness without a someone who is connected. The biological organism provides precisely that unifying subject, the same human being who underlies every stage of mental development. To deny that is to deny the existence of the very person whose moral status we are evaluating. In simpler terms, Parfit and McMahan treat consciousness like a series of disconnected dots, as if what matters is the pattern itself rather than the person who lives it. But those mental states don't flow freely. They belong to a living being. The unborn isn't just a potential stream of experiences waiting to form, it's already the person who will later have those experiences, just as the sleeping person is still the same self who will later wake up. In conclusion, Parfit and McMahan attempt to locate more worth in consciousness, but consciousness presupposes a being who is conscious. The view replaces the person with the process, and in doing so, it loses that foundation for personhood itself. The unborn human is not a faintly connected potential self, it is the same individual who will later think, remember, and choose. Once we see that, the appeal to psychological continuity fails to justify treating any stage of human life as less than fully human. When we reject the ontological account of human value, the idea that every human being has intrinsic worth simply by being human, we begin to fragment the moral landscape itself. The ontological view says that what grounds moral worth is that what we are, rational moral beings by nature, not what we can do at any given moment. But once that foundation is denied, personhood becomes something to be earned rather than something we possess. And when personhood becomes conditional, equality becomes impossible. And this isn't a hypothetical concern, it's a pattern that we've seen throughout history. Anytime any society has tied human value to characteristics like intelligence, race, strength, or even social usefulness, the result has always been exclusion and eventually violence. The logic is always the same. Some lives are less human than others. Robert P. George put it this way: once we shift from the view that human beings are valuable in virtue of what they are to the view that only some human beings are valuable because of some acquired characteristics, the equality of all human beings in fundamental rights collapses. In other words, if being human is not enough, then we no longer have a principled reason to say that all humans are equal. Equality becomes a matter of social agreement, not a moral truth. And what society gives, society can take away. Once the ontological foundation is gone, morality becomes utilitarian and selective. We begin to ask who is useful, who is self-aware, or who is wanted, rather than who is human. This leads to an ever-shifting moral standard, one that expands or contracts depending on culture, convenience, power. And it's as Patrick Lee and Robert P. George argue in their book Body Self Dualism. They say that this division between the biological and the moral self is philosophically incoherent. They say a human being is not a mind-body composite made up of two separate things, but a single, unified substance, a rational animal. To deny the moral standing of the human organism is to deny the very subject who is capable of moral action. That means that the embryo or fetus is not a different kind of being from the adult. It is the same individual at a different stage of development. Rejecting that continuity doesn't make moral reasoning clear. It destroys the basis for any stable concept of personhood. Imagine a world where person is defined by function rather than nature. In such a world, those who lose cognitive ability, memory, or independence could all lose their moral standing as well. The unborn, the disabled, and again the elderly would all exist on a moral spectrum instead of under one moral law. If rights depend on functions that can appear and disappear, then no one's rights are truly secure. And this is the inevitable consequences of rejecting the ontological account. We can no longer say why all human beings deserve moral respect. We can only say which ones do for now. And as George and Tollefson summarize, the only coherent account of human equality is that every human being, simply by virtue of what he or she is, has an equal fundamental right to life. To deny that is to replace equality with hierarchy. The ontological account protects everyone equally because it recognizes that moral worth isn't something gained, developed, or assigned. It's inherent. Without that foundation, our moral framework loses coherence. Ethics become negotiation, justice becomes preference, and human rights become whatever those in power decide they should be. Now we've come to the fifth major objection raised in this debate, the appeal to bodily autonomy. Even if the unborn is a human being, many argue that abortion can still be justified on the grounds of bodily autonomy. The idea that every person has the right to control their own body and that no one, not even a person with full rights to life, has the right to use another's body without their consent. This argument is most famously presented by philosopher Judith Jarvis Thomson in her 1971 essay, A Defense of Abortion. She offers what's now called the violinist analogy. It goes like this. You wake up in the morning and find yourself back to back in bed with an unconscious violinist. He has been found to have fatal kidney alignment, and the Society of Music Lovers has canvassed all the available medical records and found that you alone have the right blood type to help. So they kidnap you, and last night the violinist's circulatory system was plugged into yours so that your kidneys can be used to extract poison from his blood as well as your own. If he is unplugged from you now, he will die. But if you stay connected for 9 months, he will recover. Thompson's conclusion is that even if the violinist is a person with full moral rights, you're not morally obligated to keep him alive by remaining physically attached against your will. She argues that pregnancy, especially when unwanted or caused by rape, is morally similar. Now, at first glance, this sounds intuitively persuasive. It appeals to something that's true, right? That forced physical use of another's body is a serious violation. But when we look more closely, Thompson's analogy begins to break down. The first problem is that pregnancy is not an artificial or coerced dependency. It's the natural continuation of a biological process that, by its nature, is ordered towards new life. In Thompson's story, the violinist's dependence is the result of an act of kidnapping, which is an unnatural and involuntary connection. But in pregnancy, even when unplanned, the child's dependence arises from the natural structure of human reproduction. As Patrick Lee explains, the mother and the unborn child are not two strangers. They are two human beings in a unique natural relationship. The child's dependence on the mother is not a case of wrongful use, but of natural biological order. To destroy that life is not to withdraw support, it is to kill. So pregnancy isn't a situation where one person's body is being hijacked. It's a case of one human being naturally developing within another, a relationship built into how human life begins. Thompson's analogy also overlooks a crucial difference: consent. In her story, you were kidnapped and attached to the violinist without permission. But in most pregnancies, the act that brings about conception, sexual intercourse, is itself a voluntary act ordered towards reproduction. When someone consents to sex, they're not consenting to be pregnant on purpose, but they are consenting to an act that by its nature can bring about pregnancy. It's like driving a car. You may not intend to crash, no one does, but by choosing to drive, you accept responsibility for what may naturally result from that action. And if you caused a wreck through your own voluntary decision to drive, you can't claim you had no part in bringing about its effect. Likewise, when someone freely engages in sex, an act ordered towards creating new life, they accept moral responsibility for the possibility of that life coming into existence. Pregnancy is not an unjust invasion, but a foreseeable and natural result of a freely chosen act. To reject that consequence while embracing the act itself is to detach oneself from the moral reality of what that act is. Thompson's analogy therefore only fits the exceptional case of rape, not the vast majority of abortions that follow consensual intercourse. The next issue is that bodily rights, while real, are not absolute. Having the right to control one's body does not entail the right to use that control to intentionally end another person's life. Even outside of pregnancy, this distinction is morally obvious. A parent cannot refuse all care to a newborn on the grounds that feeding or holding the child requires the use of their body. The duty to care for the dependent child is a positive moral obligation that arises from the parent-child relationship, not a voluntary contract, but a natural bond. Francis Beckwith explains this point. The unborn is not part of the mother's body in the same way her organs are. It is a distinct organism with its own genetic code and developmental trajectory. The claim, my body, my choice, fails because the choice in question involves the body and life of another human being. To appeal to bodily autonomy as justification for abortion is to extend the principle beyond its moral limits. Autonomy allows self-governance. It does not authorize the direct killing of another innocent human being whose body depends temporarily on ours. Finally, what about cases of rape, situations where the woman did not consent to the sexual act that caused conception? Now, I want to be clear that rape is a grave moral wrong. It's an assault on the victim's body, dignity, and agency. The mother in such a case bears no responsibility for the conception because she is the victim of an unspeakable injustice. But the tragedy of conception through rape does not change the nature of the child conceived. The child is not the aggressor or the violator. The child is an innocent human being who now exists. As George and Tollefson write, it is always tragic when pregnancy results from rape, but the injustice of the conception does not justify another injustice, intentionally killing the child who has come to be. Compassion requires protecting both mother and child, not eliminating one to relieve the suffering of the other. The moral challenge in such cases is immense, but justice cannot permit the killing of an innocent to alleviate the suffering of another. The answer to one act of violence cannot be another act of violence. And here again is where Thomson's reasoning begins to unravel. If we claim that a woman has the moral right to end the life of her child because that child came into existence through rape, then what principle limits that right to the womb? The child who is born is numerically identical to the same human being who once existed in the womb. If it was permissible to end that life before birth, on what basis would it be impermissible after birth? Once we grant that circumstances of conception can determine the worth of a human life, the moral foundation of human equality is lost. Compassion rightly demands that we care for both the mother and the child to bring healing without taking life. True justice never requires the destruction of the innocent. It calls us to love the victims of violence in a way that refuses to repeat that violence. So in conclusion, though bodily autonomy is a genuine moral good, it does not stand above every other moral principle. The right to control one's body cannot include the right to destroy another's body, especially when the other one is its own child. Pregnancy, even when tragic or unwanted, involves two human beings whose life have equal moral worth. Recognizing that truth doesn't minimize the woman's suffering, it honors it by refusing to ground compassion in injustice. Now, the last arguments that we'll go over are the contraceptive and IVF arguments. Some critics argue that if we take the ontological view seriously, the view that I hold that believes that all human life has intrinsic value from conception, then we must also reject practices like conception and IVF. The challenges go something like this. If you say that human beings deserve protection from conception onward, then what about birth control that prevents conception or IVF procedures that create and sometimes destroys embryos? And at first glance, this might look like a problem of consistency, but the confusion here isn't in our position. It's in how the objection misunderstands it. Once we look more carefully at what these practices involve, the differences becomes clear. Now let's start with contraception. Contraception prevents conception from happening in the first place. It doesn't end a life that already exists. It prevents the conditions necessary for conception. The moral issue we've been addressing in this entire argument, abortion, concerns the killing of an existing human being, not the prevention of potential life. To put it simply, there is a moral difference between preventing something from coming to be and destroying something that already exists. The first concerns potential life, the second concerns actual human life, and it is the latter that the ontological argument condemns. And philosophically speaking, the ontological account is not about processes, but about ontology itself. the question of what that thing is once it exists. An act that prevents fertilization does not harm anyone because there is no existing human being to harm. Now, that doesn't mean that all uses of contraception are morally neutral. There's a broader ethical conversation about how contraception shapes our view of sex, responsibility, and the meaning of procreation. Treating sex as detached from its natural procreative power can foster the mentality that life is something that we can choose to accept or reject, and that mentality makes abortion seem like a reasonable backup. But that's a different moral issue. The key here is that contraception by itself is not equivalent to abortion. Now, IVF raises very different moral questions. Unlike contraception, IVF does not prevent life, it intentionally creates it, but in the way that separates conception from a moral act and subjects human life to technological control. Though IVF, often pursued with good intentions from couples longing to have children and desiring to form a family, which I agree and believe that it's normal and a good desire to have, but as moral reasoning teaches us, the goodness of an end does not justify the means used to achieve it. In IVF, new human beings are created in a laboratory, often many more than will ever be implanted. Some embryos are frozen indefinitely, others are discarded or destroyed in the process of selection. Still, others are used for scientific research or genetic screening. Robert P. George and Christopher Tollefson explain why this is morally inconsistent with the equal dignity of all human beings. They say, to produce human embryos with the foreseen intention of discarding or freezing them is to instrumentalize human life, to treat human beings as subjects of experiment or as objects of use. This violates the moral truth that human life is not something we make, but something we receive. In other words, IVF turns procreation, which should be an act of mutual self-giving between a husband and a wife, into a process of production. And when human life becomes a product, it inevitably becomes something that can be selected, controlled, and discarded. The moral wrong of IVF, then, isn't just the freezing or destruction of embryos, it's in the very act of separating the creation of human life from the natural and personal act of love by which that life should come to be. By reducing conception to a technical achievement, IVF treats children as outcomes to be achieved rather than persons to be welcomed. Again, the ontological view provides the moral clarity that unites all of this. Every human being from the moment of conception possesses the same intrinsic dignity and moral worth. That means that any deliberate act that destroys, exploits, or manipulates human life, whether inside or outside the womb, violates the same moral principle, and it's not inconsistent to condemn abortion and IVF together. It's inconsistent to condemn one while justifying the other. George and Tollefson summarized this consistency well. The only coherent account of human equality is that every human being, simply by virtue of what he or she is, has equal fundamental rights to life. The moment we treat human beings as products or property, equality collapses. This is the moral line that runs through every stage of this argument. Human dignity does not depend on location, development, or circumstances. It depends on what we are. Once we abandon that truth, whether in abortion, IVF, or research, we lose the foundation for any claim of human equality. Now, we spent this video examining one of the most important moral questions our society faces, the question of abortion. We've traced it through biology, metaphysics, and ethics, and through arguments about personhood, consciousness, rights, and autonomy. And through it all, one truth stood firm. And every human being from conception onward possesses an equal and intrinsic worth simply by virtue of being human. This ontological account of human value is not sentimental or religiously imposed. It's grounded in reason and the very nature of what a human being is. If we lose that foundation, then human equality collapses and our moral language becomes nothing more than preference and power. Philosophically, we've seen that grounding human worth in anything other than our nature, whether it be function, development, or awareness, leads inevitably to inequality. If only the strong, the conscious, or the independent count as persons, then the weak, the unborn, the disabled, or even the dying can all be excluded by definition. But if being human is enough, if what we are grounds our dignity, then no one can be excluded. That's why the ontological view is not only morally consistent, but the only foundation that truly secures justice and equality for all. Now, philosophy can show us that human life has intrinsic value, but it can only take us so far. It tells us that human beings have dignity, but not why that dignity exists in the first place. It points us towards the very foundation that reason itself can uncover, a moral order grounded in God, who is both the author of our nature and the source of our worth. This is not an appeal to blind faith, but rather it's the only explanation that makes ultimate sense of what reason already affirms. The Christian vision doesn't just add theology to philosophy, it grounds philosophy in reality. It tells us why every human being from the embryo to the elderly matters, because each one of us bears the divine image, the imago Dei. So when I speak as a Christian who's an abolitionist, I'm not shifting away from reason, I'm following it to its logical conclusion. If every human being has equal moral worth, there must be something about that that transcends circumstances, capacity, and culture. That something is not a trait we develop, but an identity we bear, the image of God impressed upon every human life. Being made in the imago Dei is the ultimate ontological foundation for human dignity. It tells us that our worth is not derived from usefulness or awareness, but from the divine likeness stamped upon every being. That is why to destroy innocent human life is not merely to wrong a person, but to desecrate what God himself has declared sacred. But that truth also opens the door to hope, because if we're made in God's image, then our worth is not destroyed by our sin. It's redeemed by his mercy. The same God who made us in his image also entered into that image in the person of Jesus Christ to redeem what sin had broken. He took upon himself our guilt, including the guilt of every sin against life, and he offered forgiveness through his death and resurrection. So if you've been a part of abortion, whether directly or indirectly, know this: there is grace greater than guilt and mercy deeper than regret. In Christ, there is forgiveness, restoration, and the power to walk in newness of life. If anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The Christian message doesn't just condemn what's wrong, it reclaims what has been destroyed and distorted by sin. It's not only about ending abortion, it's about restoring a vision of humanity grounded in the image of God. So as we close, remember what's at stake. If human life has intrinsic worth, then we must live, legislate, and love in light of that truth. We must defend the vulnerable, not because it's convenient, but because it's right. Now, if you made it to the end of this video and this video or this content help you think more clearly or help answer some questions that you might have had, I would love it if you would like, subscribe, and again, don't forget to hit that bell notification icon. That way you don't miss any of the future videos. If you have any questions or comments regarding this topic, then please comment them down and let me know what you think. I would love to go over any other questions that you might have, but until next time, God bless.